The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, Isadora Pembridge had become someone else entirely. She had not chosen the name herself. It had been her mother's idea, years ago, whispered between them like a secret, kept against a future neither of them wanted to imagine. If it ever comes to that, her mother had said, "You will be Nell, just Nell, a girl from Derbyshire who needs work and knows how to keep quiet about it." Her mother had been practical in that particular way that women who have survived difficult marriages often are. She had understood, long before Isadora did, that the Pembridge estate would not pass to Isadora simply because it should. It had not. Her uncle's solicitor arrived on a Tuesday. By Thursday, every room in Pembridge Hall had been inventoried, sealed, or stripped of anything that could be carried. The solicitor was a small man with ink-stained fingers and the careful eyes of someone who had delivered bad news before and expected to do so again. He explained, without meeting her gaze, that the entail had always favored the male line, that her uncle's creditors had been patient, that the arrangement with Lord Ashvane of Thornmere had been made some months ago, quietly, before her uncle's death, and that the transaction was now final. Lord Ashvane, he said, had purchased the estate outright. Isadora had stood in the doorway of her own sitting room while he told her this. She had kept her hands very still at her sides. She had not cried, because she had understood, somewhere below the level of rational thought, that crying would not accomplish anything, and might, in fact, make the solicitor feel better about himself. And she did not want to give him that. She had left Pembridge Hall on a Friday morning, carrying 2 bags and the miniature portrait of her mother that she had taken from its frame and tucked inside her coat before anyone thought to inventory it. She did not look back at the house. She had told herself she would not, and she had kept to it. The position at Thornmere had not been her idea either. That had been Mrs. Daunt's. Mrs. Daunt was her mother's oldest friend, and had lived for 20 years in a village 6 miles from Thornmere. She had connections, as she put it, of a practical nature. She knew the housekeeper at Thornmere. She knew that Thornmere was perpetually understaffed, that the house was enormous and difficult to heat, and that Lord Ashvane, the son, not the father who had made the original transaction, preferred order to sentiment, and was not in the habit of looking too closely at the people who cleaned his fireplaces. It was not a kind solution, Mrs. Daunt acknowledged, sitting across from Isadora in her small parlor with her hands wrapped around a teacup. But it was a practical one. Isadora thought about the miniature portrait inside her coat. She thought about Pembridge Hall and the inventory, and the solicitor's ink-stained fingers. She said yes. The housekeeper at Thornmere was a woman named Mrs. Crawdon, and she was not unkind, but she was precise. She interviewed Nell. Isadora had to remind herself, twice, that she was Nell now, in a room off the main kitchen that smelled of beeswax and dried lavender. She asked about her previous experience in terms of references. She noted, with a slight elevation of her brows, that Nell's hands were rather soft for a girl who had spent 4 years in service. Isadora said she had worked in a house where gloves were required for all indoor tasks. Mrs. Crawdon wrote something in her ledger and did not press the matter further. The room Isadora was given was small and north-facing and not particularly warm. The bed had a narrow iron frame and a quilt that had once been a finer thing, and had since been repaired so many times that the repairs outnumbered the original cloth. She sat on the edge of it that first evening and took the miniature from inside her coat and looked at her mother's face for a long time. Her mother had been 26 in the portrait. She looked composed and a little amused, as though the painter had said something she found privately funny, but had not thought it worth responding to. Isadora had always liked that about the portrait. It looked like her mother. She tucked it under the mattress and went down to help with dinner. Thornmere was larger than she had been prepared for. She had grown up at Pembridge Hall, which was not a small house, but Thornmere was a different order of thing entirely. It had been built in the early part of the last century and added to in every subsequent generation by owners who seemed to have had both money and an inability to leave things as they found them. There were wings that no one used, and corridors that led to other corridors, and a library that took up the entirety of the east side of the house's second floor. She was not supposed to go into the library. Her duties were confined to the west wing and the ground floor rooms, which was where the household lived. The library was kept locked except on Thursdays, when it was aired and dusted, and that task had been assigned to a girl named Polly, who had been doing it for 2 years and saw no reason to share the responsibility. Isadora found herself thinking about the library more than she should have. She knew why. She had been in the Pembridge library every week of her life until she was 23. She had learned to read in it. She had learned French and a passable amount of Latin and a great deal about the history of the English wool trade, because her father had kept a peculiar collection, and she had been, from a young age, indiscriminate in her reading habits. She missed it the way she missed the house itself. Not sharply, most of the time, but steadily, like a sound that was always present beneath other sounds. She had been at Thornmere for 6 days when she first saw Lord Ashvane. She had not been expecting him. Mrs. Crawdon had said, during the initial interview, that his lordship was rarely in residence before November, that he spent the autumn months at his other properties, and that when he was in residence he was not difficult in his habits, but was particular about the condition of his study and the temperature of his coffee. Isadora had taken this to mean that she was unlikely to encounter him directly, and had adjusted her understanding of the situation accordingly. She was carrying a coal scuttle along the east corridor on a Wednesday morning when he turned the corner at the far end and walked toward her. She had a half-second to think several things simultaneously: that he was taller than she had imagined from Mrs. Daunt's description, that he moved quickly, with the concentrated attention of a man who was usually somewhere else in his head, that he had not noticed her yet, and then he did. He stopped. He was, she estimated, somewhere in his middle 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting, and eyes that were currently doing the work of assessment with a thoroughness she found unsettling. He looked at her the way people look at a detail they were not expecting to find in a familiar room. She curtsied, because she was Nell, and Nell would curtsy, and said, "Good morning, Your Grace." "Lord Ashvane," he said without particular emphasis. "I don't hold the dukedom. I beg your pardon, my lord." He nodded once, and continued past her down the corridor. She stood very still until she heard the library door open and close. Her hands were shaking slightly. She noticed it only when she looked down at the coal scuttle and saw the faint tremor. She told herself it was cold. The corridor was cold. It was a reasonable explanation. She learned his habits without intending to. This was a function of the work more than of any design on her part. When you kept a house, you learned the rhythms of the people in it, because the work required it. Lord Ashvane rose at 6, did not take breakfast until 7:30, spent his mornings in the library or the estate office, and did not like to be interrupted during either. He took his meals alone except on Tuesdays, when his solicitor came from the village. He walked the grounds every evening before dark in all weather, and came back with mud on his boots and an expression of someone who had been thinking and had not finished yet. He had not looked at her directly since the corridor. She told herself this was fortunate. It was safer to be overlooked. She was Nell, and Nell was nobody of consequence, and nobody of consequence was exactly what she needed to be. The problem was the library, Thursdays. She had managed to arrange herself near the east corridor on 3 consecutive Thursdays, ostensibly occupied with tasks that required no particular location, and she had watched Polly come and go with the cleaning things, and she had not gone in because she had a sensible understanding of what she was risking. But she thought about it. She thought about the particular smell of old books and the way light moved through high windows on autumn mornings. She thought about it more than was reasonable. On the fourth Thursday, Polly developed a cold. Mrs. Crawdon was occupied with a delivery that had arrived wrong and needed to be recounted. She handed Isadora the key to the library with the distracted efficiency of a woman who had 17 things to manage and needed to resolve one of them immediately. "Dust the shelves along the north wall," she said. "Air the room for 20 minutes, no more. Leave the key on my desk when you're done." The library smelled exactly as she had known it would. She stood in the doorway for a moment, which she could not afford to do and did anyway, and then she went in and began to work. The shelves along the north wall were older than the rest of the room, darker wood with smaller shelves, and the books on them were the kind that had been acquired with intention rather than decoration. Correspondence volumes, estate histories, collections of letters bound in cloth. She was dusting the upper shelves when she noticed the spine. It was a narrow volume, hardly wider than her hand, bound in dark green cloth with gold lettering that had faded to the point of illegibility from the outside, but resolved, when she tilted the volume toward the light, into a name she knew. Pembridge. Correspondence. 1804 to 1817. She stood very still for a long time. She took it down. She did not read it in the library. That was the one sensible thing she did in the entire episode. She tucked it under her apron, which she was aware was theft, and chose not to think about in those terms. And she aired the room for 20 minutes and locked the door and returned the key to Mrs. Crawdon's desk and went back to her room. She read it that evening by the light of a single candle, sitting on the floor with her back against the bed because the chair was too close to the door and she did not want to be visible to anyone who might look through the gap at the bottom. The letters were her grandfather's. Not all of them. The volume was a collection. Correspondence between several parties, compiled, she thought, by someone who had been keeping records rather than preserving sentiment. Her grandfather's letters were interspersed with letters from others, and she read them in the order they appeared rather than sorting by author, and she began to understand, gradually and then all at once, something she had not known. Her grandfather and the previous Lord Ashvane, not the man who had purchased Pembridge Hall, but his father, the one who had built the east wing of Thornmere, had been in correspondence for over a decade. The letters were businesslike on the surface, concerning themselves with estate management, wool prices, and the condition of the road between their two properties. But beneath the business, if you read carefully, there was something else. They had been friends, genuinely, in the way that men of their generation were rarely permitted to be in writing, with the careful indirection of people who had learned to say important things sideways. There were references to conversations that had evidently taken place in person, to an understanding between them, to a matter they both referred to obliquely but never named directly. And at the end of the last letter, written in her grandfather's hand in 1817, 3 months before he died, there was a sentence that she read 4 times before she was certain she had understood it. "I have made arrangements with Aldous regarding the matter we discussed. The girl is to be provided for regardless of what the entail determines. I have his word, and his word has always been sufficient." The girl. She did not know who the girl was. She did not know what the matter was that they had discussed. But she knew her grandfather's handwriting, and she knew that Aldous was the name of the previous Lord Ashvane, and she knew that her grandfather had trusted him with something. She sat with the volume in her lap for a long time after the candle had burned down far enough to be concerning. Whatever her grandfather had arranged, it had not survived the generations between him and the man currently occupying Thornmere. Or perhaps it had, and she simply didn't know. She almost put the volume back. She had worked out a reasonable plan for doing so, an excuse to be in the East Corridor on Thursday, a moment when Mrs. Crawdon was occupied, the key on the desk and the book in its place, and no one the wiser. She had been rehearsing it in the way she had learned to rehearse things since leaving Pembridge Hall, turning it over in her mind to find the places where it might go wrong. She was carrying clean linen to the upper rooms on a Monday morning when Lord Ashfane opened the door of his study and nearly walked into her. He stopped. She stopped. She had the volume under the linen in the basket she was carrying. She was aware of it with a specificity that was almost physical, the way you are aware of a splinter before it starts to hurt. "Nell," he said. She registered, with a small portion of her mind that was still operating normally, that he had learned her name. "My lord," she said. He did not move immediately, which was unusual. In her experience of him, he was always in the process of going somewhere, and the process did not pause for much. He was looking at her with the same expression he had worn in the corridor, the expression of a detail that did not quite resolve. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "4 weeks, my lord. Where were you before?" She had the answer ready. She had had it ready since Mrs. Daunt had helped her construct it. A house in Derbyshire, a family named Bracewell, a position she had left when the family relocated to the continent. The name Bracewell was real, the family connection was not. Mrs. Daunt had been thorough. She said the words she had prepared, and they came out evenly, which she was grateful for. He nodded slowly. His expression did not change. "You speak well," he said, "for a house in Derbyshire." She felt the cold move up from her hands to somewhere in the center of her chest. She said, "My mother kept a good household, my lord. She was particular about it." He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. "I see," he said, and went back into his study. She stood in the corridor holding the linen basket and not breathing properly for approximately 30 seconds. Then she went upstairs and put the clean linen where it was supposed to go, and she thought, very clearly, that she needed to return the volume as soon as possible and find a way to leave Thornmere before she made a mistake she couldn't recover from. She had not returned the volume. She had not left. She had told herself it was because leaving quickly would cause questions, which was true. She had told herself it was because she had nowhere obvious to go, which was also true. She had not told herself the other thing, which was that she needed to know what her grandfather had arranged, and whether Lord Ashfane knew about it, and whether the arrangement was the reason Thornmere had acquired Pembridge Hall in the first place. She found the answer, or part of it, on a Wednesday. She had been keeping careful track of when the study was occupied, and when it was not. Lord Ashfane spent his mornings there, but took his afternoon walk between 2 and 4, and the study was left unlocked during this time, because, she suspected, he did not consider the contents of it to be anyone's concern but his own. He was not wrong about that, in the general case. She was not a general case. She went in during his walk, on the pretext of cleaning the grate, which was a task that was genuinely needed, and which provided an entirely reasonable explanation for her presence if she was found there. She cleaned the grate. She was quick and thorough and made no more noise than necessary. And then she looked at the surface of his desk, which was the look of a man who worked systematically. Papers in order, nothing left out that was not currently in use. There was a folder of correspondence near the left edge. She did not touch it, but she could read the topmost letter from where she stood, because she had good eyes, and the handwriting was large, and she was close enough, and she had told herself, very specifically, that she was not going to touch anything. The letter was from a solicitor in London. It concerned a matter described as the Pembridge arrangement, and it referenced a deed of agreement dated 1817, and it said, in the measured language of men who deal in legal documents, that the original terms of the agreement had been preserved in the estate records, and that Lord Ashvane might wish to review them before the matter of the current occupant was decided. The current occupant. Her. She was the current occupant of exactly nothing, she reminded herself. She was Nell, from Derbyshire, who was cleaning the grate. But the deed of agreement, dated 1817, was real. She had read her grandfather's letter. I have made arrangements with Aldous. The arrangement had survived. Lord Ashvane knew about it. He had purchased Pembridge Hall knowing about it, and he had not acted on it. She stood up from the grate, and her knees were not entirely steady, and she picked up her things and left the study and walked back down the corridor to the kitchen stairs. And she was thinking, for the first time since she had left Pembridge Hall, something that was uncomfortably close to anger. She had meant to say nothing. This was the plan she kept returning to, in the evenings when she had time to think. Say nothing, find the deed, understand what it said, and then decide what to do with the information from a position of knowledge rather than a position of reaction. Her mother had been practical. She was her mother's daughter. But she had not been sleeping well, and she was tired in the specific way that makes the careful plans seem less important than they did when you were not tired. And she had been at Thornmere for 6 weeks now. And the letter had said the current occupant, and she kept thinking about the inventory and the solicitor's ink-stained fingers and the way he had not met her eyes. She encountered Lord Ashvane on a Thursday afternoon in the corridor outside the library. He was coming out as she was passing. He was carrying 2 volumes under his arm and reading a third, which she had noticed was a habit of his. He often had more books in transit than could be managed with full attention to his surroundings. He looked up when she stepped to the side to let him pass. She had not planned to say anything. She had very specifically decided not to say anything. She said, "Do you know the name Pembridge, my lord?" He went very still. It was not the stillness of surprise exactly. It was more like the stillness of someone who has been waiting for a particular piece of information and has just received it from an unexpected direction. He looked at her with an attention that was entirely different from the general assessment she had seen in the corridor 6 weeks ago. He said, "Where did you hear that name?" "I grew up near there," she said, which was true. It was entirely true. She had grown up in there, which was a distinction she was choosing not to make explicit. He was quiet for a moment. "Come into the library," he said. She told him most of it, not everything. Not the volume of correspondence she had borrowed, and not the fact that she had been in his study reading his correspondence, because some things were confessions she could make later, from a position of greater stability. But she told him that she was Isadora Pembridge, that she was the daughter of the man who had spent 30 years managing an estate she had expected to inherit, and that she had taken a position in his household because she had needed to understand what had happened, and no one was going to explain it to her directly. He listened without interrupting, which she had not expected. He sat across from her at one of the library tables with his hands flat on the surface, and his expression giving nothing away, and he let her speak until she had said everything she intended to say. Then he was quiet for a moment. "The deed," he said, "is in the estate records. You're correct that it exists. Your grandfather and my grandfather made an agreement in 1817 that was not an entailment, but was intended to operate as a parallel guarantee, that the female line of the Pembridge family would be provided for if the estate passed from them. And," she said, "because there was clearly more, and my father did not know about it," he said. He was not a meticulous man when it came to records. "The transaction with your uncle's creditors was made without his solicitors reviewing the older estate papers. By the time I became aware of the deed's existence, Pembridge Hall had already been sold, and you had—" He paused. "You had apparently disappeared." She looked at him. "I was not hard to find," she said. "No," he said, and something shifted in his expression. "You were not." She understood then that he had known. Not immediately. She believed that part, the part about his father's inattention to the records. But at some point in the past 6 weeks, Lord Ashvane had known that Nell, who spoke too well for a house in Derbyshire and had hands too soft for 4 years in service, was not from Derbyshire and had not been in service before Thornmere. "How long?" she asked. He met her eyes without looking away. "The 2nd week," he said. The 2nd week. She thought about the corridor with the coal scuttle, about the linen basket, about the moment outside the study when he had said, "You speak well for a house in Derbyshire," and she had been so certain she had narrowly avoided something. "You didn't say anything," she said. "No," he agreed. "I wanted to understand what you were looking for." The library was very quiet. Outside one of the high windows, a rook called once and then was silent. "Did you?" she asked. "Understand it?" He looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she could not quite name, but recognized as one that would take time to read correctly, if she was given the time. "Yes," he said, "I think I did." She did not leave Thornmere in the way she had planned. She did not leave on her own terms, in the middle of the night, with 2 bags and a miniature portrait tucked inside her coat. She stayed through November and into the early winter, while Lord Ashvane's solicitors and her own, a man Mrs. Daunt had recommended, who turned out to have sharp eyes and a long memory for detail, worked through the question of the 1817 deed and what it was and was not legally required to provide. The answer, when it came, was not everything she had imagined. The deed was old, and its language was not specific enough to compel a restoration of the property. What it compelled, the solicitors agreed, was a provision, the nature of which was to be negotiated. The negotiation took 3 weeks. She was present for the final meeting, which took place in the estate office on a December morning with frost on the windows and a fire that had been built up against the cold. Lord Ashvane sat on one side of the table. Her solicitor sat beside her. The estate papers were spread between them. She had come to Thornmere looking for an answer. She had found several, and not all of them were about the estate. She was not romantic about what had happened between them in the library and in the corridors, and in the careful conversations they had begun to have in the evenings, when the rest of the house was quiet and neither of them had manufactured a reason to be elsewhere. She was not 20 years old. She understood that the situation was complicated and that the complications did not resolve simply because 2 people had decided to be honest with each other. But she was also not her uncle, who had looked at a difficult situation and chosen the easiest available exit. She was her mother's daughter, who had been practical and also, in the end, someone who had trusted the right person with something that mattered. She sat at the table in the estate office while the solicitors spoke, and she looked at the deed her grandfather had written in 1817, and she thought about what it meant that the man across the table had known who she was for 5 of the 6 weeks she had spent in his house, and had said nothing, and had waited with a patience she was still trying to fully account for her to come to him in her own time. "I have made arrangements," her grandfather had written. "I have his word, and his word has always been sufficient." She looked up from the document and found Lord Ashvane watching her across the table, with the expression she had been learning to read. The one that was careful and thorough, and, underneath both, something considerably warmer than either. She thought that perhaps her grandfather had understood something about the Ashvane family that she was only beginning to. She looked back down at the deed, and for the first time since a Tuesday in October, she allowed herself to consider that this might, eventually, be something she did not have to carry alone.